Good evening, everybody. I'm Sam Kitchen-Smith, the LRB's Head of Special Projects, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome both to those in the room and those joining us online to Conway Hall for an event that is genuinely very special, even though that's what people always say about events. Special because it's our first in-person event since the start of the pandemic, and while COVID rates might mean it's also our last for a while, it's still pretty exciting. Special because it represents the coming together of several treasured things. Our heroic podcast partners of several years talking politics, the LRB Bookshop's never more ambitious events programme, our growing list of publishing and co-publishing projects, in the case of Mantel Pieces, working with exemplary partners, Fourth Estate, and most treasured of all, Hilary Mantel, one of the LRB's greatest contributors, one of the present moment's greatest writers. The paper's 30-year association with Hilary, culminating in Mantel Pieces, is something of which we're very proud. Before I hand over to Dave Runciman, a few bits of housekeeping. You'll have seen that there are copies of the new paperback edition of Mantel Pieces and Confronting Leviathan, David's new book, many signed by the authors, on sale in the foyer. These will be available after the event and can also be bought online with the link lrb.me/powerbooks. The bar will also be open after the event. Online tickets for the other events in this week's Subject-Object series of conversations about power, tomorrow, Mary Beard and Michael Wolff, and on Friday, Emma Klein and Adam Phillips, can be booked at lrb.me/power. Thanks for keeping your masks on throughout, unless you're exempt. David will explain how the event will go and how audience questions will work. A few quick thank yous to Conway Hall, to Nicholas Pearson and Patrick Hargaden at Fourth Estate, to Catherine Carr and the Talking Politics team, to Natalia Clare and the London Review Bookshop team, and of course, to David, Helen and Hilary. Over to them.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to everyone here and welcome to everybody who's watching online as well. It is an enormous pleasure for Helen Thompson and myself to be able to talk to Hilary Mantel this evening. Helen and I spent quite a lot of lockdown talking about Hilary's magnificent Thomas Cromwell trilogy, particularly The Mirror and the Light, and we had so many things that we wanted to say about it that we ended up recording a podcast about it without Hilary, and so it's a thrill for us to be able to have some of these conversations with Hilary Mantel. But we're also here to celebrate the publication of Mantel Pieces in paperback, and as I'm sure you've heard, it's available to buy after this event. Hilary's writings from the LRB over more than 30 years on a whole range of subjects, but including Tudor history, which is where we're going to start. We'll broaden it out. We'll talk about Cromwell, we'll talk about Henry VIII, but we will make our way to the present too. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience here, but also if you have questions online, they will find their way to somebody in the front row who will pass them on to us. So we'll come to that at the end. But Hilary, we thought we would start actually, the last two essays in Mantel Pieces are about two Tudor figures, Charles Brandon and Margaret Pole, not nearly as well known as Cromwell and Anne Boleyn and the characters in the Wolf Hall trilogy, but fascinating in their own right, because though Margaret Pole in the end loses her life, and you use the chilling phrase, in an act of housekeeping.
Yes.
They had to clear out the Tower of London, and so unfortunately she was there. But she was a great survivor to that point. She lived, by Tudor standards, a long life despite being the mother of one of Henry's great enemies. Charles Brandon was his dear friend, and he survived the whole thing. How did anyone survive that world? What did it take to survive the court of Henry VIII?
Well, I think in the case of Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, he had made one brilliant career move as a young man. He'd married Henry's sister, Mary Rose, the youngest of the princesses. Brandon, for one thing, didn't represent a threat to Henry in the way some of the old dynasties did. The Brandons had been gentry, no better, but it really was all about what did your ancestors do at the Battle of Bosworth? Going right back to 1485, the foundation of the Tudor dynasty. And Charles Brandon's grandfather allegedly carried the Tudor standard. And this began the family's elevation. And then Charles Brandon, he was a big fellow. He was a kind of body double for Henry. He was often taken by foreign ambassadors to be Henry's illegitimate brother. But Charles Brandon was older, and he had inducted Henry into the sport of jousting. Charles was thick as mince, as people say these days, which proved a survival factor because his lack of the kind of noble family background that made him a rival, and his willingness to prance about looking every inch the Tudor, but not really interested in real power. This meant that almost everyone could find some point of contact with him that wasn't rivalry. And as I say, he did marry Henry's sister. Mary Rose was sent to France as a beautiful storybook princess in her late teens to marry the aged King of France. And it was said that she danced him to death. He was done within a few months. But then, having got the King of France, the King of England's sister in his possession, the incoming king, Francis I, detained her for reasons of his own. Mary Rose she had gone very unwillingly to France, and she had apparently extracted a promise from Henry that when she danced him to death, her next husband would be her own choice. After the old king's death, Charles Brandon was one of the delegation who went over to try to bring her home, extract her from French custody. And she wanted to marry Charles Brandon. It was, as simple as that. She'd fallen in love, and Charles, they had a bit of a history. They'd shown a preference for each other before. Henry had warned Charles, do not do this. She's a valuable property. I'm going to marry her to someone else. But Charles said, I never saw a woman so weep. This is what he wrote home to Henry. So in conclusion, I married her. He married her to stop her crying. He did have a certain endearing streak in his character. Mary Rose didn't last. She didn't have a long life. But he became, in effect, a brother to Henry. And one of the great survivors of the reign. Stephen Gunn wrote this wonderful scholarly biography of him. But, it's a sad fact about the people in Henry's reign, that having your head cut off is what makes you famous. And Charles is very interesting, but he managed to die in his bed. Although so did the Duke of Norfolk, who was a dynastic rival to Henry and was in trouble for most of the reign, regularly kicked out of the court and then brought back. But what happened with Norfolk is that he got on the wrong side of Henry for good and all. It looked like it. He and his son, the Earl of Surrey, the poet, were both imprisoned. Surrey was executed. Norfolk was due to go to the block the next day. Henry died in the night. Just can you imagine the morning when the door of your room creaks open and they say, Your Grace, you're off the hook. No, it's not a scene I could write because it happens post-Cromwell.
Obviously, one of the essays in the book, perhaps the most famous for various reasons, is called Royal Bodies.
Yes.
And at the heart of monarchy is always the journey of a body from birth, procreation to death. If you, at least in a hereditary monarchy, if that doesn't happen, there is no monarchy. So in one sense, it's kind of predictable that a big story about this particular dynasty, where you have a king who has difficulty producing a male heir and understands, as you have him tell Cromwell at one point, look, if the king can't do this, the king can't do anything at all. It doesn't matter what else that the king does. But why do you think this is such a powerful story about fertility and the body and what happens to it? Because as you say, I think it's in that essay, is you could just tell the story of Henry and his wives by body parts, and whether the body parts are diseased or whether they're fit for purpose.
Yes, I suppose this business of physicality is the way, it gets to the heart of the way we're fascinated by royal personage, because love, marriage, sex, procreation, children, the loss of children, they run through all our lives. They're the backbone of our lives. But in this way, our private difficulties, private tragedies, are writ large in the public sphere. It all constellates around this subject of the monarch's reproductive powers. And Henry expresses the view in my book, in The Mirror and the Light, as he ages. He says, they say if the king is sick, then the Commonwealth is sick. And if I'm not in good health, then England cannot be in good health. And it's a simple, but it's an age-old and powerful folk belief, I suppose you could say. It's almost ingrained. It's the stuff of magic, of poetry, of Arthurian legend. But it's written on the bodies of real people. And in Wolf Hall, I have Mr. Risley say that however powerful, however clever, however dedicated the king's ministers are, they can't give him a son. The only thing is, only a woman can do this, but which woman? And Anne Boleyn is pregnant at the time. He's saying this, and he says, what a pity they haven't got a transparent panel so that we can look through them and see what's inside. So it's not only a question of reproduction, but there is a riddle here, there is a mystery about femininity and its power that the men in the reign can't solve. And of course, this is the era as well where the feminine is being dethroned. The virgins, the statues of Mary all over England are being pulled down and defaced, and the image is being replaced by the word. And we will go on, of course, into a couple of reigns later. We will have Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, as a sort of reassertion of all those frozen, fallen idols. If you think of her in portraits in her later days, this absolutely frozen figure who could be carved in stone. And these are not things that they are not topics of political discourse. They're running under political discourse. I'm fascinated by the operation at a symbolic level, of the translation into symbol and magic of political tropes.
Christopher, just one more thing on this. I was thinking as I was reading bits of the books again over the last few weeks, that actually, if you think, go back to the book of Genesis and like the birth of Israel, and you have these three women with fertility problems at the beginning of the story, yes. Sarah, Rebecca and Rachel. So it seems to me that perhaps there's kind of something like primordial about this idea of a new country being born, a new England being born in that case, in our case, a new Israel being born, where you need a kind of struggle over fertility, and that actually that's part of why that this touches us so deeply, because it's not just an English story, it's a really old story about the birth of something, yes. of a kingdom being tied up with women's fertility, in the
yes.
case of the Bible, the problems of women's fertility.
That's right. The symbols, the equivalences are absolutely timeless and universal.
And we haven't left it entirely behind, so we're living
absolutely
in an age where the Queen spends a night in hospital, and there's something out there in the ether which no one quite knows how to think about it or report on it. And there is an obsession with it and with the passage of a human life, a single human life, which is completely outside of democratic politics. So in the sense that the rhythms of democratic politics, the births and deaths of political careers, are nothing like the life of the Queen.
It's hanging over us very heavily, isn't it? If you think about what's been happening in this country and through the world, of course, in the last couple of years, what other time, except during, well, it wouldn't happen during the war, you switch on the evening news and the first thing you hear is how many people have died. And the mortality figures dominate every day. I was going to say it would happen in a war, but of course in a war they would lie about it. But all we have heard for a couple of years now is the young are dying, the old are dying, we cannot get to them, we cannot comfort them, we cannot access them. And so last week, when the Queen spent that night in hospital, I got a couple of contacts right away, people asking me to write about it, saying either, well, basically saying quite boldly, can you write an article about the imminent death of the Queen? And I began to feel I was being made into a vulture. And of course, because I may not be a monarchist, but I'm not a brute. I think, well, what is it like to be the child of a woman, or to be the woman herself, knowing that every breath is being counted? And I was thinking about royal bodies in another way as well last week, because somebody approached me about painting a portrait of me, and it was someone who has painted the Queen. So I wanted to look at her work, and then I got very interested, and I started bringing up images, image after image. I don't know how many times the Queen has been painted, or her image reproduced. Hundreds, it seemed. Almost as if she spent her whole reign sitting for a portrait, but I suppose they take some photographs and then she sends them away and they get on with it. But anyway, as you know, most of these portraits are just hideous. They're just so kitsch. And of course it encapsulates the whole problem. How do you portray a modern monarch? There are the ones in which, the Antigone type portraits, in which she is portrayed as a mythical figure, a sort of Britannia figure, a conqueror, and she's wearing sweeping, dramatic clothes and so on. But then there's her lovely sort of 1950s curly perm that looks as if it was done by Darlene at headlines on the corner, you know? And it doesn't fit with this mythological personage at all. And then there are the ones where she doesn't look like a queen at all, but she just looks like someone's grandma, which of course she is. And both, I mean, that they seem to be completely missing the point. And the portrait painters are congratulated for portraying her as an ordinary person. It's hard to see what else they can do. Anyway, I decided my favourite image, and now I can't think who did it, but it's kind of print, and it's more or less simply a head, not head and shoulders, just a head. Almost as if it were a stamp, but the person is looking at you instead of being in profile. And the Queen's got her eyes closed. And I thought, yes, I'd close my eyes too. I wouldn't want to see you lot. I wouldn't want to see my subjects who were all waiting for me to die. What she looks is she looks exasperated. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if that has been the reigning emotion at the palace for quite a time now. I suppose it could also symbolise a shutting out of reality.
And I said that the rhythm of democratic life was so different, but we had a moment during the pandemic when Boris Johnson went into intensive care, where suddenly the whole tenor of politics shifted, and it wasn't a million miles away from that extraordinary moment that you tell it's in Bring Up the Bodies, when Henry is injured in the jousting accident, and Cromwell has to bring him back to life, because everything hangs in the balance. It hangs in the balance, and we're so unused to it in our political life, but in Cromwell's world, a death changes everything, and death is always around the corner.
Well, exactly, because if that had been Boris's moment to go, there'd be another Tory along in a minute. But that wasn't the case.
Although his Cromwells wouldn't have done too well. He couldn't. We'll come on to his Cromwells a bit.
It was a question of then who's the heir? Is it the Princess Mary from the first marriage? Is it the child in Anne Boleyn's womb? So there is, some impromptu and rough resuscitation performed on Henry. I'm only guessing. I mean, the whole incident's so completely obscure. We only learn of it in retrospect. It was, as it were, wiped out of the record.
But Cromwell's life, as you describe it, he feels his life hangs in the balance with every breath of his king. It's his life.
But isn't it more, actually, that on the other side of, in this case, as far as Cromwell's concerned, of Henry stopping breathing, is civil war? Is this kind of England gets plunged back into darkness at the point? And I don't think, whatever had happened in the pandemic, if Boris Johnson hadn't come out of that hospital, we wouldn't have been plunged into darkness. I think that's what makes the difference, is that there was a certain symbolism to it, like it was more than just the Prime Minister, but I think that was partly to do with the history of Brexit, but it's not that the whole kingdom and the escape, if you want to go back into Hobbes's language, like of the state of nature, can't depend upon the Prime Minister's body in the way in which it could depend on Henry's body at that moment. And maybe it doesn't always in monarchy, but it does when you're the only second monarch in a new dynasty, and what came before it was civil war. Well,
This is true. I mean, the Tudors had kept the peace for 40 years, whereas the era before had been an era of considerable, very long-running strife. When we call it the Wars of the Roses, it always sounds so cute, but there were some very miserable and bloody battles fought. And what you have under the Tudors is, great conditions for early capitalism, really. Peace, flourishing trade. You need to keep the peace for the country's economic development. And Cromwell very much had an eye on this. So I don't think this was really special pleading on behalf of the Tudors. I think they did value and feel that England needed that stability. And so the dynastic question, it becomes absolutely crucial to the reign. And, this is one of the wonderful things about, as a woman author, writing about this era, because you don't have to force your female figures into the story. You don't have to pretend that they were more important than they were, because they were absolutely central. And there, and again, here's the paradox. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Parr, these were very remarkable women in their own right. But what they get reduced to is womb. And one of the things I talked about in that essay, Royal Bodies, is how, as with those portraits of the Queen, where she's either Granny or Britannia, there's this inherent contradiction. Are we talking about gods or are we talking about animals? Because at one point they are ridiculously exalted beyond all human sense, and yet reduced to vaginas, wombs, public property. And of course, this isn't something that's waned with time, it's intensified with time. The prurient curiosity around a pregnant princess, or the marriage of a princess who is expected to be pregnant very quickly. This was what started off Royal Bodies, in a sense. It was before Kate was the mother, when she was a bride, and already you felt her person being impinged upon. It wasn't, as it was taken to be, hostile to monarchy, because I think, in a sense, I don't care about it all that much. I think I didn't mean to become a royal watcher. Or the go-to person when you think the Queen is dying. To me, the modern monarchy is way down the list of issues that the nation ought to be discussing. But it was strange what happened then, because I ended the essay by saying to the press, don't do what you did to Diana. Back off and don't be brutes. But somehow, when this had been filtered through the press, and perhaps I shouldn't be surprised, it became a horribly offensive diatribe directed at the monarchy, which it wasn't at all, and led to led to a couple of papers sending people down to besiege me at my house. And what was so funny about it was how uninformed they were, because they'd been sent off to catch this horrible woman, but they weren't armed with a picture or anything like that. So they know roughly where I live, on the seafront. So then any woman of a certain age and a certain bulk who came out of her house, they'd run up to her saying, "Are you Hilary Mantel?" Well, Budley Salterton, can you imagine how this goes down? They don't even admit the existence of low papers there, let alone talk to them. So none of my neighbours would admit to where I lived. And I just drew the blinds. And my publisher sent me a food parcel.
And it went away.
Yes, but I had no idea what was going to be detonated there.
So one of the things, if we go back to Cromwell and the trilogy, and I'm sure many, many people here have read the books, and one of the things that's so distinctive about them is that the line between the living and the dead is not at all clear, in the sense that everyone is haunted. I mean, there are ghosts everywhere. Cromwell is haunted. Henry is haunted. Henry's haunted by his dead brother. The dead speak to the living.
Yes.
And in a way, I don't know, I mean, this is a genuine question. It feels very remote in some ways from us, that particularly as an account of sort of high politics, where so much of it is filtered through the voices of people who aren't actually there. And yet it's not that remote from us.
Well, I think actually the ghosts can be equated with intuition. They are like your inner voice. They're your conscience speaking to you. So ghosts are what they call them, but they could equally well call them guilt talking or shame talking. And again, you see, someone like Cromwell, this is very interesting to me. I've done something that, if I'd thought about it this way, I might not have attempted it. It seems to me that he was not an introspective man. He was not a man with a rich inner life. Or if he was, it's inaccessible. He's not like Thomas More, telling you about the state of his soul at every turn. Cromwell tells you nothing. The letters he writes are official letters. And when you find a little outburst of temper or passion between the lines, you'll hoard it like a fine gemstone because it's so rare. So my concept of him is that he's a person who's outward directed. He doesn't retrospect. It's like, you know, if you were facing fast bowling, you can't think about the ball that went before. You've got to look straight ahead and it's next ball, please. And that, it's rather Thatcherite, you know? You do not suspect that this person goes home and agonizes. So, having decided that Cromwell was this sort of person, I then undertook to write from the inside of him, as it were. So I have to ask myself, how does such a person correspond with their inner self? What do they do when they are perplexed and don't know where to turn? Well, Cromwell thinks, what would Wolsey have done? And because everyone's sense of the next life and the afterlife is so strong, and there are no unbelievers, then it is natural to think of Wolsey's living presence. I mean, this is how we do it in our play, because people said, well, how are you going to put this on stage? Because the mirror and the light is so much about Cromwell's interiority. How will you represent that on stage? Well, when he's having a hard time and he's puzzled, then simply a big fat scarlet ghost pops up and tells him what he already knows but can't formulate or can't access. And I think that's what ghosts do for us, whether we're then or now.
But isn't there also this sense of the ghosts that he is creating, the ghosts of the Catholic England that he's destroying? There's that scene in Mirror and the Light with Norfolk. I can't remember, sometimes you're in the pilgrimage of grace,
Yes.
where basically Norfolk's really had it with him because he's basically desecrated his ancestors' graves. And, and it's this stuff that Cromwell doesn't actually have some ability to understand. That's quite a Catholic idea of thinking about these things. They're actually going to come back and play their part in his hubris, the part that he doesn't understand, and that will in the end finish him off.
Well, of course, we think of Norfolk as one of the defenders of the old faith, but he didn't actually lift a finger for it. When the monasteries were dissolved, he was there holding out his hand. Everybody suspected he was a secret papist, but he regarded his pocket first. And what happened with the Duke of Norfolk is in early 1540, he went to France, basically to foment plots against Cromwell. And Cromwell dissolved Thetford Abbey, where the Duke's ancestors lay. And actually Dermot McCullough thinks that this was quite an important factor that spring, because the Duke and Cromwell had always managed to work together somehow. They had this very fragile rapprochement, but it was as if they'd suddenly declared war on each other. But I think, I agree with that, but I think the problem for the Duke was that it cost a lot of money to rebury his ancestors at Framlingham. And I think he was a man strictly with an eye on his ledgers more than his Bible. Well, not his Bible at all, in fact. I should say more than his prayer book. You know, the Duke said that I have never read the scriptures, and I never will. And I wish that all things should be as they were in times past. And this was his declaration, but we shouldn't take it too seriously, because he was up for any new money-making scheme. And I think...
But these things are not incompatible, are they, with each other? These things aren't incompatible with each other. People can be obsessed with money and still have a sort of sentimental view of...
Yes,
like
that's right. I don't think we should regard him primarily as a spiritually motivated being. But you see, I think there's something that Cromwell understood well, and could work with such people. One thing he said was, I think was rather important, was that people don't like change unless it puts them in better ease. And in a nutshell, well, that's the credo of a pragmatic politician. And his career was a question of how can we create this better ease, which meant, as I say, creating the conditions in which early capitalism could flourish, creating a strong economy, creating trading links. But I think there have been worse manifestos. It's not, I think you would call it a manifesto, not a creed. It's highly practical.
Thinking about the difference between then and now, so we still have ghosts in our politics, but they're still alive in the sense that... And even Blair. I mean, the thing about our ghosts, Blair and Brown have been on TV haunting us with their memories of the new lady is David Cameron. Donald Trump, I mean, the difference then and now is that they really did shuffle off the scene, and then they have to be recreated as inner voices. And one of the oddities of democratic politics, because we vote them out of office, but we allow them to continue talking, is we are haunted still. It feels a bit like, Jeremy Corbyn haunts politics, and they're still here and they pop up. It's a difference.
And people talk about the Corbyn era as as if it were 40 years back at least. You know, the ghosts are circulating faster and faster. They're really nimble and fleet-footed these days.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating about reading about Cromwell and Henry's court is we still have court politics. I mean, there is still a court of Boris Johnson. There was a court of Donald Trump. You know, it was positively medieval, as people said, or early modern. And yet, it's not a world where death stalks the corridors of power. What stalks the corridors of power is the loss of power. But it's not a total loss of power. It's certainly not a total loss of influence. And they circulate round.
Yes.
It's Cromwell's story, Henry's story is so modern and it's so distant because death is real. That's not a question, is it? It's just
but there is a way in which...
It's a good observation.
Thank you.
This is another different kind of observation, but there's a certain parallel, though, because the other thing that's there in the Tudor world is these fake people. You know, the people who are pretending to be somebody who could be an heir to the throne. So the people who are pretending to be Margaret Pole's brother, you know, for instance, who are posing all these problems to these.
I'm fascinated by the imposters.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the people who come out of the grave and haunt whoever is the current king with an army behind them. Particularly, you know, in the early reign of Henry VII, this is fascinating because he's plagued by the princes in the tower rising from the grave, by ghosts of the living, people impersonating the young Earl of Warwick, whom he has shut in the tower, and he can produce him alive, but that doesn't stop him multiplying elsewhere in Europe. And those stories are fascinating because, again, it brings us back to the royal body and what does it mean to impersonate a royal person. Particularly, this brilliant story that runs through Henry VII's reign of the impersonator who should be known as Peter Warbeck, but it's actually always called Perkin Warbeck, which was a shrewd move by Tudor propagandists because it stopped posterity taking him seriously at all. I would love to write a novel about Peter Warbeck, but I can't cope with a character called Perkin. I'm sorry, I just can't do it. And Anne Rowe wrote a brilliant book about this particular pretender. We had this discussion because, you know, she said, yes, she too had thought the novel form, with its slipperiness and ambiguity, is perfect for this. I think the question about royal pretenders is, do they start to believe their own pretense at some stage?
And as well, it kind of is in some tension, isn't it, with the bodies, because it should just be about you have to have a royal body. And actually, you've got all these people saying it doesn't really matter because I can impersonate somebody else's body. And it's because actually monarchy is a fairly fragile form of government in a dynastic sense that these pretenders arise. Because there's always someone who's actually going to be, at least in English history at that point, there's always someone who's actually going to be threatening to take the throne away.
To take
the throne away.
Yes. Yes.
And so if you can pretend to be one of the people who've got some claim from the previous dynasty, then you can play in this game of royal bodies, but fake bodies, not real bodies. Even at the same time as everybody's obsessed with the actual bodies of the ones who've got their royal blood.
And in Tudor times as well, it was so much about what hangs on that body. Because Peter Warbeck in Ireland, he'd worked for a silk merchant. He was, in effect, a male model. You dressed Perkin up and you sent him walking about the city in beautiful clothes, and people said, who did that doublet for you? And popped along to his master. But so magnificent was Perkin in his silks. that people started to nudge each other and say, well, he could be the dead Duke of York, couldn't he? And of course, this is a world in which, you know, I find it very moving. People didn't know what their grandparents looked like. It's a simple thought, but it's a very profound one. Think back to an era before photographs, and it's not that long ago. And in Tudor England, identity could be fudged and falsified, and that obviously includes royal identity. So it isn't so much something special about the royal body, but something special about the presentation of the body. People had no idea even what Henry VIII looked like. Copies of portraits can only circulate so far, and probably I almost said in my day, but you know what I mean, the day I'm writing about. Probably the best known face in Europe was Martin Luther, because of the enormous efficiency of the German printing industry and the number of images there were in circulation. And so people may have known what Luther looked like without knowing what their own king looked like.
And in Mantel Pieces, you also write about French revolutionary politics in your great novel, A Place of Greater Safety, and you write about Danton, Robespierre. And court politics is court politics, and high politics is high politics. But by the time of the French Revolution, we also have the crowd. And the crowd isn't really a presence in the Tudor story. I mean, it is a bit, there's a performative aspect to it.
Yes.
But it's highly controlled.
Yes.
And something breaks loose with the birth of modern politics, which is at the end of the 18th century. When you write about that, how does it change it, having this extra character in the story, which essentially is the public? There isn't that kind of public in the Tudor world.
Yes, of course, I wrote A Place of Greater Safety a long, long time ago, long before the Tudors were in my mind. Also, I began writing it in the 70s, and it was really, I suppose, our interest in the crowd. It was there, but history was not so sociological, more political. The kind of material that was available to me was not really encouraging you to think about sociological phenomena. And then everything changed, and we wanted to forget all about the middle-class revolutionaries and their troubles, and we wanted to concentrate on working-class people and the formation of public opinion and so on. But I was aware of it because, very early in A Place of Greater Safety, one of the older characters, who was a Treasury official, says one day, I remember when we didn't have public opinion. Because what he is saying is we used to be able to keep affairs of state to ourselves, we at the Treasury, them at the palace. We ran things between us. We controlled circulation of information. And then the king decided, as it were, to throw open politics by calling the Estates General. And debate could no longer be suppressed. And the crowd, the popular figures, the popular movement is a kind of background noise, I suppose, in the novel. Because had I wanted to write about popular leaders, there wasn't the information, there isn't the information. And it being a novel, you've got to pick your people. Now, maybe today I would make different choices, but you know, the educated middle-class lawyers was where I went. But I'm always sensitive to this issue because I think actually in one of the pieces in the book, the writer Ruth Skur, whose biography of Robespierre I enjoyed very much, I did take her to task on one point, saying the plural of Parisian is not mob. And again, you get this very consequential carelessness in discourse that turns any gathering of citizens in the revolution into a mob, which arouses my indignation.
So we want to come to your questions. I have one more. Helen, do you have one more? Okay, so this is the last one. That we thought we should ask one Dominic Cummings question. And it's this, which is, one can just about imagine Dominic Cummings in the world of Henry VIII. One can just about imagine Thomas Cromwell in the world of Boris Johnson. Which one do you think would be better equipped to navigate the other world?
Oh, I'll give Cromwell a mobile phone and he'd rule the world. It was amazing what feats those people performed. Okay, I know it's not glamorous stuff and it doesn't sound very exciting, but Cromwell undertook to survey the property of the church, which in England was huge and extensive. He did it in 6 months, and the figures were good and the figures were accurate, and I am told that in some respects the Victorians were still relying on them. When the job got done, it stayed done. What Cromwell was very good at was showing people how to work for him. So you go to a certain institution and you ask 86 questions. Come back with the answers to these 86 questions. We know everything, and we'll compare them with the 86 answers to the next institution. So this kind of, okay, as I say, it doesn't sound very glamorous, but intellect at the top, and then that organised kind of intellect that knows how to get the job done. I think what's always engaged me about Thomas Cromwell is his creativity. And I think creativity in politics is quite a rare quality, as opposed to a desperate grubbing for novelty. And he was someone who saw the big picture, but could also take care of every detail. And I suppose ultimately that was why I wanted to spend all those years in his company, simply because I thought he was a very clever man, and I thought by hanging around with him, I might get a bit smarter.
So on that note, we'd like to open it up to questions. I think we have a couple of microphones. And we'll be taking some questions from our online audience as well. But are there a couple of people in the audience who would like to ask Hilary a question? So we have someone at the front here. You're allowed to take your mask off.
Hello. One of the things that you do quite extraordinarily, one of the many things you do that's quite extraordinary in your trilogy is you depict, I think, what it feels like to live in a monarchy, a genuine monarchy, and what that means at a very deep and profound level. And it's sort of interesting to hear you discuss your ambivalence or possibly even disinterest in monarchy as an institution. And I'm wondering, do you think that was a help or a hindrance in tackling this many years long project of depicting what it means to live in that world?
So the question is, given you've expressed some disinterest or uninterest in monarchy, and yet the books are such a profound meditation on monarchy as a form of power and of government, did that the wider feeling you have about monarchy help or hinder that years-long project?
Yes, that is a really good question. I think the fact of my skepticism and my drawing back a little from the subject, not being enchanted or englamoured by monarchy, I think that's a good place to stand. I think that as an imaginative writer, you always want a place you can step back to get a little distance, get a little perspective. But, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 4 years, and I think that, in many ways, that was a privilege. I wasn't working on the Henry books then, I hadn't thought about them. But living in a monarchy that actually has power, and also in a theocracy, is a piece of luck that doesn't come the way of many imaginative writers. And I was very conscious from the moment I landed in the small hours of the morning, and I saw King Abdulaziz International Airport lined with huge black and white photographs of members of the ruling house. And this despite the Islamic prohibition on images, which held elsewhere in the city no statues of people. But then the airport is, as they say, the good old liminal zone where the rules are a bit different. And there they were, much, much bigger than life size, the monarch and his brothers and his cousins. And perhaps, in some ways, my fascination with a monarchy that really mattered was triggered back then.
Some more questions. So I can't really see.
Someone sort of 2/3 of the way back on this side, David, like
Yeah.
back there.
Can we pass the mic?
Hilary, you said you wanted to get a bit clever after spending time with Thomas Cromwell. I wanted to ask, how has your understanding of power changed, political power, personal power, in the years that you spent with him?
My take on power?
Yeah, how's it changed in the years you spent with Thomas?
I don't think it has. I think I knew all about power when I was so high. Children tend to. You grow up into a world where somebody makes the rules and it's not you. You don't understand the rules. They change arbitrarily. The consequences of breaking them are awful. I understood, I think, from the time I went to school. I suppose I'll have to ask you to believe me on this, but I was a very self-aware little being. And when I went into the infant's classroom, I was appalled by the servile nature of my desk mates. The teacher came in. Why couldn't they just say, hello? Instead they said, good morning, Mrs. Simpson. And it was like living with, well, I thought at first lunatics, and then I thought slaves. And I also perceived another thing that was about inequality. I perceived by the age of 6, we'd been sorted out into 2 groups of children. The clean ones, with respectable clothes, got the harder arithmetic to do. Then there was the other blackboard for the children of large families who were wearing their brothers and sisters' cast-offs. It wouldn't be demarcated like that nowadays. It wouldn't be so naked, but one does wonder if it still operates. And I became a social justice warrior from that point, because I was so aware of poverty and the assumptions that were made on the back of poverty. And I think I lived then, all my life until blessed adulthood took over, in this state of anomie, alienation, fury, really, at being so powerless. And therefore, when I've written about politics, and this is why I wrote my French Revolution book, as I did, my identification was never with the ruling class or the ruling clique. When I tried to get my French Revolution book published at first, it went years without a publisher because people simply didn't understand this kind of fiction. They thought, and this is very English, I suppose, books about the French Revolution, novels, they have to be about those ladies with high hair. And they're always about the aristocrats, and it's always a case of, it's the Scarlet Pimpernel, that's the only story. Or A Tale of Two Cities, that's the only story. Where the French Revolution was a shocking bad hats, and it's something I could never see. It was completely alien to me. So my notion of power was, I'm the underdog. So that's the viewpoint from which I'm going to write. Didn't strike me as being about gender in those days. It struck me as being about class and money. And ethnicity to some extent because of the English-Irish divide in my village. So I have sought ways to express my feelings about power through fiction. And I have repurposed my indignation, if you like, through a number of centuries and a number of dead persons whom I've tried to resurrect. But I have a feeling I'm telling the story that I told myself when I was 4.
And just to add, is it partly because as an adult politics has disappointed you, that you felt that the indignation doesn't actually have a satisfactory outlet? Are you hankering for something more from political life than it delivers, democratic political life?
It disappointed me in that it can be so relentlessly trivial and so relentlessly focused on personalities rather than issues. But then I suppose I'm asking for human beings to be more perfect than they are, because we all love a good gossip about Dominic Cummings or Boris or anyone else. But it's in a way, it's we should keep it as a hobby, It's blinded us to what really counts in the world. And I suppose, if you were writing about the modern monarchy, not in Henry's day, when it really did matter, but again, this is a supreme form of gossip, isn't it? And that's why I say it's not, I didn't intend to become a royal commentator. It's not high on my personal agenda. But it's the fact that we're all talking about it tonight, it's absorbingly interesting.
But haven't you shown, even in what you've just been saying, that it's absorbingly interesting, not just as gossip, it's absorbingly interesting because it gets into all this symbolic stuff and these sort of primordial stories in ways that actually, in some sense, are easier for us to comprehend than democratic politics. It's not that this stuff isn't there in democratic politics, but we just can't somehow react to it in the same way. We can't have intuitions about it in the same way that produce such powerful emotions in us.
Well, yes, I think that's true too, because I suppose one of the things that's always fascinated me is the intersection between politics and psychology. I mean, that's where I've tried to go to work in every book I've written. And by politics, I don't mean party politics. I mean the exercise and distribution of power. I think all my books are about power in one way or another. And so, yes, I'm not, by saying it's not an important issue, I'm not scanting the importance of the symbolic, of the archetypal. But we are curiously unaware of its workings, and perhaps this is why that essay, Royal Bodies, created such a fuss.
So I know we've got a few questions from our online audience, so do you want to ask a couple, Sam?
Yeah, sure. Patricia asks, why are the monarchies still here? How is their power tolerated by the British public? And Sylvia asks, did you fall in love with your version of Cromwell, as I, and I suppose most readers did?
Well, I think actually in many ways we've covered the first question. I personally have never been a respecter of persons, and as I said to the gentleman back there, the point of deference is entirely lost on me. But I have to say that, as the example of my classmates showed, people were eager to adore their teacher, the Virgin Mary, basically put their attention to what it was directed to. And one of those things, as you grew up, as I did, a child in the 50s, I should say at this point, speaking of the 50s, there was a point at which I think Prince Charles must have been my hero, because I saw him wearing a particularly natty, double-breasted woolly cardigan. And I asked to have one knitted for myself in canary yellow. This only came back to my mind. It would not be true to say that I did not go through a phase of admiring royalty. But I will say I must have grown out of the cardigan, so the phase was mercifully short. Moving on to this next question, which I've now forgotten, Sam. Oh, about being in love with Thomas Cromwell. No, difficult, because I am Thomas Cromwell. Be very afraid. Do you know, I so, with respect to the listener, I loathe this question because I think it's never asked of male authors. And it really is a way of, this, a questioner may not mean it, but to me it is a very belittling question. That your only strong relationship with a dead man, after all, it's all rather absurd, but, your only relation to him can be that you are infatuated with him. Well, I just don't see this at all, because along with my fixation on power, I suppose, from being a small child, was a fixation on the figure of the hero. You're often asked when you do those kind of Sunday paper, Sunday supplement questionnaire things, who is your hero? And I've always taken it as axiomatic that all heroes have feet of clay and all statues should be pulled down. But at the same time, as a child, the figure of the outstanding person, you could say, fascinated me. And then later, when I came to write about the French Revolution, I wrote about the person who is carried on the shoulders of the crowd, figuratively or literally, and who thereby loses possession of themselves, is in some way desouled because they become a collective possession. I thought a lot about that. I thought a lot about why some people's names survive and why others don't. And often it seems quite an arbitrary process. But bourgeois as it may seem, I have no trouble as a novelist in writing about the outstanding individual. And I genuinely admired Cromwell. And I think maybe a bit, I did want to be him. It's an imaginative exercise you enter into. But in love, puts that person, that object, in a different sort of relation to you. And if you bear with me for a minute, I could perhaps say something about where the novelist stands. Because a few years ago, I wrote a story called The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher, which it caused almost as much fuss as royal bodies. And there were some people who suggested that the police ought to take an interest and maybe arrest me for the fictional murder of a woman who was already dead. And in that story is set in Windsor, where Mrs. Thatcher, in real life, was in hospital at one point, in a small hospital for an eye operation, and I happened to live in a flat that overlooked the garden of the hospital, and I stood at my window, and I thought, you could shoot her from here. So that, to people who read the story, meant if I'd had a gun, I'd have done it, and the skill. But it didn't mean that at all, and it is missing the whole point of what being a novelist, being a writer of fiction, is about. You, as a person, are suddenly removed, and another person stands there, and that person is an assassin with a gun. And for the moment, it's not a question of what you want. It's just you are that person. And I think to a large extent, that was where I was situated vis-a-vis Thomas Cromwell. Not over there adoring his hideous picture by Holbein, but looking at you through those highly mobile, piggy little eyes.
Can I just ask a variant on that, because it's something that's in the essay Royal Bodies, where you felt you stood in relation to Henry. Because one of the things that you write about is that as people try and understand how he became the monster that he became,
Yes.
you say that people don't think hard enough about what it is like to live with pain, physical pain, extreme pain. He was a man who, for much of his later life, would have been in terrible pain. Did you,
Yes.
so not so much in the Cromwell years, but some of that, I mean, it's starting to happen. What was your relationship to this person that you were creating in the novels, the king himself? Did you feel his pain?
I mean, I was very interested in the contemporary take on Henry as a great king. They cried in the streets when he died. and our conception of him as a monster, which, you know, is almost universal. But actually, when you enter into a fictional process, it's very little practical use to you to consider somebody a monster. You don't, as it were, get anywhere by having made your judgment already. So, as human beings live day to day in constant flux, you try to follow that process, and of no one was that more true than Henry. 1536, he had some kind of accident which left him with a sore leg, probably an infection in the bone that wouldn't heal. And there were times when the consequences of this, people thought he would die. Obviously, his body would be overwhelmed by infection. Other times, the wound behaved itself, the pain receded. But if you were Henry, when you woke up in the morning, you had to work out what kind of a day is this. And you had to work out, if you were Henry's minister as well, or any of the people about him, you had to work out what kind of day is this. And I do think that we have not sufficiently regarded this particular royal body and its peculiarities. And when you think what Henry went through as one thing after another went wrong with what had been a magnificently healthy body, you begin to understand from the inside how he becomes so whimsical, so capricious, so untrustworthy. I don't subscribe to the idea that there was a good Henry early in his reign and a bad Henry later, but I am interested in how it seems to me his moral standards fluctuate with his physical condition. And it is so important for a novelist, but also I think historians as well, to think about this. But we are very bad at thinking about chronic pain. Doctors are bad at thinking about it, and particularly pain that cannot readily be relieved because it's failure. And the kind of story we like is of adversity, struggle, and recovery. We're sympathetic and attuned to that story. But having lived myself in an ailing and difficult body, all I can say is that I thought about Henry perhaps in a slightly different way from a historian. It didn't get me on his side. I didn't ever contemplate turning this into a novel about Henry. It's always Henry viewed through Cromwell's eyes. But I do give Cromwell a secret book in which he talks about how to manage the king.
So we have time for a couple more questions. I'm sure there are lots, but yeah, if...
This question is inspired by, first of all, earlier, Hilary, you mentioned about the contrast between representations of monarchs as gods and animals. And then second of all, David, you talked about the introduction of the public around the French Revolution. And so my question is really whether or not representations of monarchs are there to induce the sense that they represent us or they represent something exceptional, and whether or not that has changed over time.
Well, you tell me really. Look at those, Google, images of Elizabeth II. Have a look at those that represent a goddess and those that represent a granny. And see the impossibility of striking the balance. And I think it suggests to me that representation in this instance is impossible. Does that make sense? No.
Have you lost the mic? Have you lost the microphone?
Maybe not.
The microphone has to come back. Do you have something to say on this?
Sorry, so are you saying there's a kind of inherent contradiction in this then, that they have to be both? Is that your point? They have to be both? I mean, Helen, you were
Yes,
also talking about, Helen was talking about how actually the force of the person of the monarch is in the fact it's something universal, so something common to all of us. But there seems to be this tension in that they've got to embody both, or they have to represent both us, something both common to all of us, and yet somehow exceptional, to maintain that distance between...
You seem to be answering your own question.
Well,
Yes, it's a paradox on which the institution and ourselves are completely strung up.
I think it's partly because is that the fact that monarchy or hereditary monarchy is about the cycle of life from birth until death, and that is what is common to us all. And that's more common to us than what the extraordinary politician is. We don't recognise, we find it, not obviously, thankfully for all of us, Hilary doesn't find it harder to imagine herself into Thomas Cromwell's mind, but most of us couldn't begin to have got into Thomas Cromwell's mind in the same way. But I think that we can understand the journey of the monarch in the sense of the cycles of life aspect of it, not what it's like to have your body observed all the time, and to have whether you're breathing or not seems to matter for the future of the kingdom, but that these things that are common for all our humanities are so fundamental to this form of government, I think is something that means that there is not, maybe representation, being representative is not quite the right word, but something understandable, even though in our understanding of it, I think it moves off into some kind of symbolic realm that, as Hilary said, requires words that we actually then find quite hard to find.
Any questions that aren't about monarchy?
Okay, so
Come on.
a non-monarchy question and then maybe one more from our online audience as well. No pressure.
I hope this isn't about monarchy. I think not. I wanted to ask about the women in your novels who weren't queens or princesses. And one thing that struck me was Cromwell's home life and Cromwell away from the court. It began very domestic and very simple. And by the time we get to his death and he speeds towards his death, his home is an extension of his external life. There's people in there, it's a business, it's a place of business. And how important is the loss of those relationships to the loss of power and control that Cromwell has around him? The death of his wife, his children, his relationship with his sister-in-law, things like that.
Sorry, could you?
So the question is, in Cromwell's story,
Yes.
it starts very domestic and it's anchored in a set of domestic relationships. By the time we get to the end, his domestic life is essentially an extension of his public persona.
Yes.
How much is the loss, and everyone who's read the novels will remember the harrowing scene where he comes home, finds his wife and child dead. How much is the loss of that domestic anchor significant in his story? I hope I've got that
Yes, it's, all we know really about, from the historical record, we have one letter from Cromwell to his wife when she's in London and he's up country, and it says, send me word who has resorted to me at the house since I left London, and I'm sending you a fat dough. Half of it's for you and half of it's for our neighbour. 6 lines, that's it. Story of the Cromwell marriage. So this takes me into territory where I am very, very uneasy because I have this huge disadvantage as a novelist. I hate making things up. And, I had to look at what happened after Elizabeth's death. We assume she died of the sweating sickness because around about the time she died, it was rife in England for 2 summers, the end of the 1520s. So we assume that that's what took her, and we assume that's what took the little girls. And the only thing we have to hang on to is that he didn't marry again. This was very unusual for a man in his circumstances with a young family. There was usually another wife along pretty quickly. Didn't happen in this case. So I have a choice. Was this a good marriage? Was Elizabeth irreplaceable? Or was it a case of he goes to work for Henry VIII and it's wives, wives, wives all day? All you want to do is the equivalent of getting home, opening a beer and putting on the football, if you're with me. So I chose both. Because that is always the productive way to go for a novelist. And then I have to... What I did then, I suppose, is I started a running joke about Cromwell's remarriage, in that people are always urging him to remarry, wondering why he doesn't. And then the fact that he doesn't becomes politicized in itself, and it becomes something that exposes him because he is accused of wanting to marry the king's daughter and thus make himself King Cromwell. And given that this rumour was current in Europe for years before the king decided to hear it, you wonder, well, there's one sure way out of this. Go and, as his followers say to him at one stage, the next woman you see, when you leave this room, propose to her. If she's got a husband already, never mind, we'll find some way around that. We all have enough experience. Actually, the woman he does meet is Catherine, Lady Latimer. And this is me having my little joke, because the reader who's aware will know that Lady Latimer became her birth name was Catherine Parr, and she became the 6th wife of Henry, not the wife of Cromwell at all. What I am explaining is a tissue of invention. What I'm revealing here is a tissue of invention. I think Cromwell, it seems evident to me he had women friends, which again seems very rare in that era. But access to his emotional life, his domestic life. We know all about how his household ran. We have the account books. You know what went on at Austin Friars and in his other households. But what the effective relationships were, we don't know. I once said that we know a huge amount about his public life and almost nothing about his private life, frustratingly little. And a certain historian took me to task, saying he had no private life, that he was entirely subsumed in his court career, which to a degree I understand. But even though I said Cromwell, to my mind, was not an introspective person, not possessed perhaps of a rich inner life, we do all have the thoughts of our heart. And I proceeded on that assumption. And I was torn between amusement and horror that a modern historian could suggest that a person ever lived who had no private life.
Well, I think because we've reached the end of our time and a conversation that began with politics and ended with talking about the heart, that's a great place to end. So just to say two things, one of which is you can get Mantel Pieces, the collection of Hilary's writing in the LRB, at the store outside on your way out. And the second is to ask you to join me on behalf of myself and Helen, thanking Hilary Mantel for an absolutely fascinating conversation.